All right, today's lecture is on applets to Flash. Let's go ahead with a single slide summary. All right, way back when, again, think circa 1990 or so, before the World Wide Web was really a thing, the internet only supported static content. So that meant any page that existed, it would either be text, unchanging images, whatever. You downloaded the page and you could look at it, but you couldn't do anything with it. So the other day when we were talking about the read-write web, this was the read-only web, okay? Pages existed, you could look at the pages, but there wasn't any sort of interaction with it. Of course, people wanted dynamic content, right? People want things like real-time updates to their sites. People want browser-related, browser-based games. So, key mechanisms for that. Java applets, that was sort of the first pass on an application, embedding applications in web pages. And there were other things like Ajax and Flash. So Ajax still exists. Flash, in a sense, it still exists, but it's largely been removed from the things that web browsers do. And over time, we'll see that we started seeing a lot more security vulnerabilities, and in some ways it became easier for these attacks to evade detection. So anyway, there's kind of constantly an arms race in terms of security tools. We'll talk about that in a bit too. Okay, so that's it. We'll talk about these techniques for providing dynamic content to web pages, and then we'll talk about some of the security concerns. I don't know what's going on here. A little bit, there we go. Okay, let's put it in slideshow mode then. So first question, what are applets? Well, an applet is a small Java application that's provided through a plugin, which leads us to our next question, what is a plugin? So let's pop it into Paint in a second. But first we'll talk about what they do. So applets enable running applications through web pages, right? Basically, that was one way to enable some sort of dynamic action in a web page. And things you might do with applets, things like advertising, things like playing videos, things like playing video games. All right. So how they work is fundamentally this. You have a web page. Here it is. You designate some portion of the web page as running the applet, right? So here's, I'm just gonna do an applet tag. Okay, and you give it some size, you know, height equals, say, 250, width equals, I don't know, 400. And this isn't precise code, but it doesn't really matter because nobody uses applets anymore. Okay, and then you'd have to have another line for the source. So my app.java, for example. And that could be the, I'll just move it in here if I can grab it. That would be basically how the tag would look, right? Height and width would be written out, but whatever. Okay, so then the process is one, you load the web page. Number two, the Java application in the applet will either run automatically or when you give it permission. Okay, that's it. Now the issue here, number one, issues, you need to have Java available on your machine. Okay, we talked about this the other day. Java is a universal language that translates your hardware specifications into something called a Java virtual machine so that the Java application code can run on any hardware. Okay, you need to have Java, specifically a Java virtual machine. Without Java, your application cannot run. Okay. The other issue, all right, we'll get into this eventually, security issues, because the application doesn't run inside the browser. It actually runs separately, but has access to some browser data. Okay, so this is a thing. So various things that could potentially be dangerous, like session keys, passwords, and other sensitive information. Okay, so this is essentially the issues with Applets. It's a Java application. It runs in some limited rectangle of a web page, and there are security issues with it because it's not actually part of the web browser. It's not playing something strictly through the web browser where the set of interactions are limited. It's actually a standalone Java application that, in order to do things on the web page, needs access to various browser data, but those can be sensitive and dangerous and misused. Okay. So, history. In the late 90s, mid to late 90s, people were like, oh man, applets, these are so cool. We're glad to have them. In the early aughts, right, the early years of this century, they were, you know, popular. They got used a lot. I remember way back in the day, 20 years ago, I joined chess.com to play on there, and it was still using applets. In fact, even 10 years ago, chess.com was still using Java applets. It was one of the last big sites to stop using it. About 10 years ago, there was a radical and abrupt, you know, basically they completely died out pretty quickly. Two main reasons for that. Number one, the security problems we talked about. And number two, the graphics were pretty weak, especially compared to what you see in Flash Player. Nowadays, applets are pretty much extinct. I'm not saying you might not be able to find one out there running somewhere, but it'll be tough. You really have to look around. Okay, so let's find some examples. There is an online museum if this thing is still active. We'll see if we can find this. No, that one's gone. They used to have applets here. Not all the links are good. They disappear over time. We'll try this one. Ooh, a tripod.com. Wow. Once upon a time, tripod was one of the big. Yeah, another Java applets page. All right, let's zoom in a little bit. So this will have some. Once upon a time, tripod, there were a lot of web pages that got hosted there. It was a big thing back in the 90s. Okay, so let's go to the applets. Now, you'll see all of these are not really functional because they're disabled on here. But let's see. Let's do if we can see. It's trying to do the applets, but they're all disabled in this web browser. This is what they look like. They look like simple stuff like this. Okay, so this one, I can't even see what this guy's doing. There used to be a picture. Yeah, here's an old chess one. Okay, like I said, this is it's from Wikipedia even, but there's an article here, and here we go. Boom. Okay, so you get stuff like this. This looks like it's running on a Mac back in the day. Yeah, they'd be in a rectangular window. You could put in buttons like we do in HTML, and they could run programs. You know, it wasn't going to be something super heavy duty, but you guys certainly had enough power to run a passable chess program back in the day. Okay, so that's essentially what applets looked like, and of course they could be in color too. But this is in an old Mac that is all black and white. All right. Now, way back when, let me think about. I remember, I think it was 2004. I took one of the 500 level courses in IDS, and they were still teaching applets back then. But within a few years, that had pretty much gone away. But yeah, way back when, before Flash was a big thing, you know, they taught it in schools, and you learned how to do it. You learned how to write applications. It was a fairly widely used tool. Okay, but they're gone now. Again, how applets work, right? There's a tag, and you reference the object, the Java program in the tag, and you run them. So how it works, you download the Java file, it gets stored in your temporary internet files, and then accessed by the browser as necessary. But you don't really need to know much about how applets work at this point because they're gone. But what we can understand, it's a separate application, it's running in Java, it's not really part of the web browser itself, but it interacts with the web browser. So that's where the real problem comes in. Okay, bounce back to Paint here. If you have your browser, this is going to be your browser application, and whatever you're doing in it gets, try to grab that. If we say, I'm running a video, I'm gonna play a video in my browser. Okay, this sounds like a good idea. Well, there's two ways to do that. Number one, run some other application along with the web browser. Okay, that's the plugin. Okay, sometimes you'll see plugin hyphenated, but you know, lately you don't. Or number two, pull data from another source and display it through the browser. Okay, no other application involved. All right. Well, way back when, this was not an option. Back when, you could only do number one. Web browsers were much more simple. They didn't have these video play capabilities. So if, for example, you wanted to play a video, you had to have some other application running along with it, right? So something like QuickTime for Apple, whatever. You had some other application that hopefully was trustworthy and reliable. Of course, it would be much nicer, right, if you have just this one browser application and all it's doing is showing you stuff, and if it's pulling some information to display in a window here, there's not really anything it has to grab as far as other data from the web browser. It doesn't have a reason to access your password, doesn't have a reason to access other sensitive data. It just sets up a connection to some video frame delivery system, which keeps on sending all the frames for video, and then it just displays them. It doesn't require any access to any other information. So the second one, much more secure, but in the mid-90s, we didn't have that. Browsers weren't that advanced. Okay. So, applets and security. So why do applets inherently create security issues? Well, what they tried to do with applets was run them inside a sandbox. And the sandbox is just an artificial boundary inside your machine that basically lists the things the applet can access and the things it can't. Okay, so that was the issue. So, solution for applets: run the application inside a sandbox that defines what data the applet can access. Okay, but there's two basic problems with this. Problems with the sandbox model. Number one, what if you specify the sandbox wrongly? Okay, then the application can get stuff that it's not supposed to. And this is always going to be a bit of an issue, as I will add, hard to keep up with the full set of data and their possibilities. Okay. The other thing, even a trusted application, right? So the basic model with the sandbox is if the application wasn't trusted, like it wasn't something that the user deliberately installed from a known reputable source, it would be given a stricter sandbox. But if it was a trusted application, then you'd give it wider access. So the other possibility is, what if the application can get phony trust verification, right, or certificates. So that was another problem. If you set up some sandbox system where a trusted application has a lot more access, then another thing you might want your application to do if you're a bad guy is get some kind of phony access credentials so they can get to data that they shouldn't and do some damage. So this was a big problem. And again, these problems don't really go away. No matter what you do, if you are getting a second application to run along with your web browser, it needs to access some browser data like the session key, right? And could potentially do some damage. All right, so one of the reasons why you need a session key, we'll back up for a second. Because maybe you're wondering, hey, why do we even need a session key? Okay. Why users need session keys. Okay. Suppose you go to a big site like Facebook and you want to bounce around from page to page without signing in on every page. Okay, that's a normal thing, right? You look at many pages on Facebook, you don't want to have to sign in every place you go. To achieve that, Facebook puts a cookie on your machine, a small data file containing data about your current session. Basically, credentials indicating that you have logged in. Okay, that way, anytime you go to another Facebook page, it can just look at the cookie, verify it's you, and bring up the page. Okay? Same kind of process happens on video sites like YouTube, right? They put a cookie on your machine, they verify it's you so you don't have to keep logging in on every page. All right? Again, but if the site also runs applets, then ... you know, the sandbox hopefully prevents a non-trusted application from accessing the cookie, but it's not a sure thing. Okay, so as long as you have this kind of system where your session key, other sensitive information is stored in a cookie or otherwise stored around on your browser, yeah, there's a possibility that another application could get access to it, right? You try to build a sandbox around it, but there's ways and ways where they can get around, sneak in there. We might talk a little bit about that on Wednesday too, a little bit more detail. Okay. So again, two kinds of applets. Number one is an unsigned applet. An unsigned applet is basically not trusted, considered potentially dangerous, kept inside the sandbox, and yeah, the sandbox surprisingly often will fail. On the other hand, you can have a signed applet. A signed applet is trusted. It is not trapped in the sandbox, at which point the question becomes, how much do you trust the provider, right? Or how do you ensure that a sandbox has not somehow gotten phony trust credentials? Yeah, so this is a problem. And way back when, right, you had a lot of smart people working very hard to solve this problem, but they didn't do it. So leading to this article from 2016, goodbye applets, another cruddy piece of web tech is finally going away. Okay, so you can read about that a little bit, but yeah, Oracle which owns Java now, they wanted to keep people using applets even though they could never figure out a perfect way to secure them. Yeah, eventually they gave up, and by default they disenabled applets. Okay. Trying to get back to things here. Okay, so that's the end of applets. Again, a little bit more on attack types. We could talk about these some on Wednesday, but yeah, they had security troubles. So the big methods, if you go in and you dig around in these, and again, I'm not a security expert. I have a little bit of basic knowledge of these things. But the way they did it, number one, they typically try to appear safe to security tools. And the simplest way to do that is to get phony credentials. The second simplest way to do that is to try to find some other way to access data that's not listed on the sandbox. For example, if you can find a copy of the session key that's active at some point in memory, you might be able to use that even if you can't actually access the cookie itself. And the difficulty to this, again, an applet is supposed to run an application. So for automated security tools, it was always really difficult to detect when the application was doing something it wasn't supposed to. You couldn't just say, hey, this application is poking around in the browser and looking at things, because that was reasonable behavior as far as the automated system could determine, right? It was fairly easy to fake looking innocent. And of course, the last thing, if there are always a lot of known vulnerabilities out there. In most machines, they do get patched, but not everybody sets their patching updates to happen quickly. So sometimes these apps can find a vulnerable machine and attack them as well. So, but those are the big three, is, you know, finding a backdoor essentially to access some data you shouldn't be able to access. Number two, fake credentials. And number three, just using a known attack against people who haven't defended themselves against it. Okay. So again, applets, their current usage, you don't see them anymore. When they started getting phased out between 2005 and 2010, they got replaced by scripting languages, and the big one there is, of course, JavaScript. Yeah, and again, Oracle recently discontinued support, so that's that same link there. Anyway, so you won't see applets anymore, but it's important to know why you won't see applets, because it has a lot of relevance to Flash. Okay, next thing, we'll talk about Ajax. So what is Ajax? Well, it stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So JavaScript, we know what JavaScript is. We spent a few weeks working on it, so hopefully, you know, people do know something about that at this point. And XML is an object description language. So any sort of standardized data you want to have, XML is a way to describe it. Now, XML basically looks like HTML. Okay, so object description language looks like HTML. So tags. Okay, so for example, you might have an object, call it this thing, and then this thing might have attributes. And again, all of these things would be closed out by tags. Okay, I'm trying to type this. So it could look something like this. And then if you figured out what the thing was, you could access its various attributes by using standard dot notation. So for example, you could do in your JavaScript something like if object dot attribute one equals red, you know, dot, 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 do some code, whatever. Okay, so the XML is code that describes a thing, and it's set up, it looks like HTML. It has tags nested within other tags. All right, so Ajax isn't a specific technology. It's a general technique for making calls to servers and retrieving data from them. Now, the big innovation of this is you can update portions of a web page without reloading the entire thing. So way back when, again, pre-1995, if you wanted to update any portion of a web page, you actually had to update the entire page. So for example, way back when on eBay, okay, circa 1995, you had on eBay the issue of sniping, okay? Putting in bids at the last possible second. And if you did that, you know, you could hopefully sneak a bid in without the other person doing it. So the way it worked, if you wanted to, here's a server, I'll draw a server, I'll draw a user down here. And the user can actually have a, user will have a rounder screen. Okay. Server and user. Okay. So the user calls the server, says, please give me page. Okay. And then what happens? I gotta let the dog in. Hold on. Come here, beast. All right. Hey, buddy. Okay. The server then constructs the page with current data, like the latest bids. Okay. Then it delivers the page back. Okay, but again, if you wanted the fully updated page, you had to keep updating it. You didn't have this mechanism for automatic updates without reloading the entire page. Right. And I might add, you know, with the technology of 1995, all this page reloading was a burden for the networks, for sure, right? Because they did not have terribly high capacity. So again, things like this was a real innovation. For example, for AOL, I remember when it switched over, another example, America Online, if you saw their commercials back in the day, they had the catchphrase, "You've got mail." Right? And they had a little mail icon, and the mail icon would light up whenever you got a message. Okay? But at first, again, circa 1995, only when you logged in or refreshed the page. Eventually, though, they implemented Ajax, and you could get the notifications without refreshing, just like you do in Gmail these days, right? So Gmail, same thing. You have your webmail open, and you're looking at it, and a new email arrives, and boom, it just appears. You don't have to refresh the page. That's basically all this. All that is Ajax. I keep hitting the Z there. All right. So its history, it's not much younger than web browsers. So there was one called LiveScript for Netscape Navigator. LiveScript was closely related to JavaScript. Came out in 1995. iframes, which are tags that you can use to pull data from third parties. So for example, you have a site, somebody comes to visit the site, but you want to provide ads from an outside source or do things like allow Facebook likes on your page, use iframes for that. Okay, so that's what Ajax is. And of course, lots of examples. If you go to finance.yahoo, you can certainly find all sorts of updated market information, right? Like current stock prices or index values, whatever. Live sports results, map scrolling on Google Maps, other real-time event tracking, right? So Google Analytics, which we'll be learning about in the very near future, that uses Ajax. You have a mechanism on there where you can see who's visited your site and what they're doing within a half-hour window. Okay. So how does Ajax work? Well, number one, you have some kind of client-side script to do the dynamic page content changes. Okay, so you need something like JavaScript to do it. If you don't have any sort of scripting languages, then your page just is what it is when you load. You need some kind of script to make changes happen. Okay, now there can be some problems with this. Number one, right, if you're running it on your own machine, things like password verification is going to be more accessible. We'll talk about maybe PHP in a little bit later. The other thing, you might have to access a server, right? So typically that is how Ajax works. You have some stuff going on your side, it calls the server, it asks for some information, the server sends the information back. So the essential mechanism for that is something called an XML HTTP request object. So XML, right, is that object description language. HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol, that's the mechanism for delivering data over the internet. And the request is you're just asking for something. Okay, so you have a script that's going to initiate a server call, and the server, once it gets that request, will send back some information. And it can either display the response or you can process it some other way. That's essentially what it does. So we have a link here. Let's see what we got. All right. So here we have a try it yourself. Boom. You can update parts of the web page. So if you want to do a very simple one like this, and it's a little hard to see because all the data is stored over on the W3 school servers. But what we have here, right, when I click on this button, on click load XML doc, here's the code that's happening, the relevant code. So it's going to create a new XML HTTP request object, okay? And it's going to basically say if it's available, if the thing was accessed successfully, that's what those codes are for. Then it's going to insert into this demo, right up here, it's going to insert into its inner HTML the response text. So it's going to grab the object from the server, and the object will contain some text. It's going to display that text on the page. Ta-da. Okay, quiet dog. So that's what it does. Now, again, on all these examples, it's not that easy to figure out what's going on because it's not, the server is not really accessible to us. But that's the idea. There's nothing with this code here, right? With the HTML request at blah, blah, blah. We could tell there's nothing here in this script that's going to generate that by itself. It has to call a server to get it. And again, this data can be framed in various formats. It can be displayed in various formats. The point is you call the server, you ask for the data, and then the web browser itself, the script figures out how to do it. Okay. And one thing we'll see, a very common security trouble is if you have the web page or the data and the server not being stored at the same location. That is considered a big risk because it could indicate that some bad guy has hacked the server and it's connecting to some other data that it's not supposed to. The other possibility, of course, is that the bad guys have actually directly hacked the server and inserted some malicious code into the page itself. And so when you see that page, then it sends you someplace bad. So anyway, Ajax is certainly not without risks, but it makes all of our fun little dynamic web page things basically work well and a lot faster because, again, don't have to load the whole page. You just have to load the little part of it that you want to change. All right. Now, again, there's a whole bunch of security issues if you're interested, right? So testing for Ajax vulnerabilities. Who knows? Maybe one of you guys will become a security expert one day. This will be your thing. Okay. There's a long list of stuff around here. You can check in some of this stuff. But yeah, there are for sure some troubles. Okay. I don't mean to, I'm not trying to hide that for sure. But what is interesting about it, Ajax is a set of techniques, right? It's not one single technology. It's not one standalone application. So where there are vulnerabilities, they're either associated with specific Ajax components or with the systems using them. So it may be that, you know, a particular technology, mostly it works fine, but if you run it in some particular vulnerable context, it creates problems. And a lot of these vulnerabilities do involve the client side. They involve the JavaScript side. So, all right. Anyway, end of plugins. So what we've seen in the last few years is that Flash Player has pretty much gone away. You don't see it. Like if I try to do something that requires Flash Player on my machine, I'll get a notification that says, lately it says, Flash support for Flash will be discontinued in December 2020. Do you really want to do this? And I have to specifically select that, yes, I do want to do Flash. Likewise, if I'm using, Mozilla, right, Firefox, then anytime I go to a site that has Flash, it says, if you want to use this, you have to specifically install Flash Player. It's not like a standard thing anymore. So Flash was great for a while, but now it no longer exists, right? Now it's not really there. Again, if you really want to use it, yeah, you can, but you know, increasingly you're going to have to jump through some hoops to do it. So way back when, these HTML features of web browsers were really limited, right? Prior to HTML5 that came out a few years ago. And so plugins were the only practical way to do dynamic content. As we've seen, they have a lot of vulnerabilities. So HTML5 came around, I believe 2014, which lets browsers perform a lot of the tasks done by plugins, right? So primarily things like high quality graphics for online games or streaming video. Once upon a time, if you went to YouTube, it used Flash Player to show its videos, but now no longer. Okay. So let's get a little bit into the history lesson of it all. So what is Flash? Well, it is a dynamic multimedia content plugin. So basically, you can watch videos, play games, that sort of thing. The neat thing about Flash is it had sharp graphics from subpixels. So this is a significant contrast between the two. Let's talk about this. Why did it work this way? Well, remember, Java is translated through the Java virtual machine to hardware, okay? So we have a kind of a related problem. So on one hand, Java is very nice because it can run on any machine, okay? But because it can run on any machine, it tends to use low-end graphics, right? Assigning values to specific pixels. Okay, reason is Java doesn't want to use advanced graphics models, advanced graphics techniques that might not run on some or most machines. All right, so Java is generally going to use older, simpler graphics. That's just how it is. Not saying they couldn't possibly do some of this stuff, but they don't. Now, yes, well, what are these advanced graphics techniques, right? What are they? What are fractional pixels, for example? Well, let me give you an example. If I zoom in, if I zoom way the hell in on this paint, okay, it still all looks black, right? Well, let's zoom in a little more. A little more, a lot more. Aha. When I'm zoomed in that much, right, you can see that on the right edges of lines, there's a little bit of blue. And on the left edges, there's a little bit of black, right? So we have this thing with fractional pixels, even in MS Paint, where I can show portions of pixels with a shaded in color to simulate the effect of looking big. It still all happens at the level of individual pixels, but it looks better. I'm going to zoom back out. Now, on the other hand, if I draw something, right, if I draw a letter using these lines, I'm just going to do it with this. I'm going to try to draw the letter H. This will, well, what's a letter that is all, I guess I'll try to draw a letter V. There. And maybe a W or a Y. Let's try a Y. Okay. The difference with Java, when I zoom in on this, you're going to see it's going to very quickly start to look pixelicious. See? It doesn't expand well. It looks like jaggedy. It's not nearly as smooth and good looking as these other ones. You see the difference? All right, so this kind of fractional pixel technique, that was something that made the graphics look a lot better than what you had in Java. Java, when you change the window size, it looked like this. Okay. One more. So, key points. Java applets looked fine as long as they ran in the correct size window, right? But you change that window size and they start to look awkward, okay? Flash, on the other hand, very flexible for resizing images or windows, right? Still looks good. Now, it's not going to look, you know, maybe quite as good as it does in its standard size, but it's still going to look pretty good. So, basically, Flash was adopted over applets because of aesthetics and the perception of better security. Okay, so by the time Flash came around, circa 2005, people were aware that applets had these security vulnerabilities. Let's talk about that. Let's go back to the slides. Okay, so there were some different products here. At one time, there was another one called Shockwave that was separate from Flash. Over time, they sort of merged together through acquisitions, through one company that bought both. And then the two products themselves became pretty much indistinguishable. So anyway, history of Flash, launched in 1996 and dominant by 2005. So circa 1996, you know, applets were very popular, you know, and there was this sort of back and forth about, well, there were a lot of competitors to Flash at the time too. There were other comparable ones like Microsoft Silverlight was one, Apple QuickTime was another. So there are various ones here. Now, we'll talk about Apple in a little bit. We'll come back to that. So where was it getting used? YouTube, other video sites, various basic games like Angry Birds, Candy Crush, things you would play in your web browser. And various web animations, you can still find those. Let's see if this, I'd have to run it in, my other browser, which is not really cooperative on this machine. Okay. Well, let's talk about security. Okay. So plugins have a lot of known security problems, right? Whether it's Java applets, whether it's Flash Player, whether Microsoft Silverlight. If we look at these, right, we can see here, what are all these troubles here? Well, we're not going to dig into what the troubles are. I'm just going to show you a list. Number of vulnerabilities, 1,078. This is for Flash Player. And you scroll through the list, a lot of them are red, right? 10.0 score, that means extreme vulnerability. You do not want these vulnerabilities to remain unfixed. So a lot of troubles there, okay? Other ones like Microsoft Silverlight, not nearly as many, even though people, so here we have total number, we just have 32, right? That's it. So people sometimes say, yeah, Microsoft code is bad, it's buggy, whatever. Well, that may be, but it's not nearly as bad and buggy as Flash Player code. So that was an issue, or is vulnerable. I guess technically that's not a bug, but defective code, sure. Okay, so what were the problems? Well, the problem is essentially the same thing. Oh, Doug's going to the vet. I got to send him down. 1 second. Off you go, Doug. You got to go to the vet. Go on. Go on, boy. Come on. Yep, I am. Here you go. Good boy. Go see. Give him a snack. She gave you a snack. Go see. It's okay. Go see, boy. Good boy. Go on. Good boy. Off you go. You got to keep calling him. He wants to stay up with me. You got to keep calling him. Go see Indy. She has a snack for you. Go on. All right. Good boy. All right. Sorry about that. We got dog stuff. Yeah, we have a dog. Anyway, okay, so there were all these security problems fundamentally because you have one application that is running along with the browser. And again, that outside application has a legitimate need to access various types of browser data. So whether that application is the Java virtual machine or one of these other plugins, it doesn't really solve the fundamental problem. Okay, it doesn't solve the fundamental problem that there's some outside application reaching into your machine and grabbing at data that's maybe a little bit dangerous if it ever gets it, maybe very dangerous. So how does this happen? How do people fall into this trap? Well, here's a timeline. Okay, so we're going to draw this. So we're going to have here 2000, and here 2010, and here 2005, and here 2015. Okay, I'm going to draw one curve for applets. So here's the usage curve for applets, right? Early on, applets are popular. They kind of peak out at, whoop, we don't want that. They kind of peak out around 2005, right? Flash starts to take over. They begin going down. Oh, that's fine, I guess. That'll do. And then around 2010 or so, they pretty much fall off the cliff. Okay, so that's, boom, sudden, abrupt, whatever. So this is applet usage. Text over here. On the other hand, Flash, right? Well, let's talk about Flash. If I can get to, damn it, if I can get to blue here. I gotta go around. All right, so Flash was a little bit slower to get caught on, but around 2005 or so, it was definitely the dominant model. Okay, so it kind of shoots up through the roof here. Okay, and then same thing, 2015, right? It starts falling down the cliff here. Boom. Okay, so that's our Flash usage. Now, what are the problems consequent to this? In terms of security troubles, what do we see? Well, put it in green if I can. There we go. What happens here, right? I'm going to do a little circle here. And another circle. Let's do it around here. Okay. So right around here, bad guys have developed many attacks against applets, but not against Flash. And the simple reason is because Flash hasn't been as popular for as long. Okay, that's part of it. The other thing is, for an applet, an attack on applets can get any machine because Java is a universal language, right? A universal language runs on any sort of hardware. running on any machine. Okay, so that's the key point here. So at this point, because the bad guys have developed a lot of attacks against applets, but not so many against Flash, and big part of the reasons why they have, number one, applets are more widely used, and number two, Java is a universal language, so if you find one of these apps, you have access to everybody. At this point, Flash seems much safer than applets, right? Because there just haven't been that many attacks. But it's not that the attacks weren't possible. It's just that the bad guys hadn't gotten around to doing them yet because, you know, applets were the low-hanging fruit, and that's what the bad guys reached for. But by this point in time, Flash very popular, applets practically dead. So bad guys are working hard to find all the weak spots in the Flash code, right? And implementations. So that's what the bad guys are doing at that point. They're saying, hey, applets are gone, Flash is popular, right? We've been working on figuring out Flash stuff for a while, but now, even though applets are gone, Flash is the big one that's left. And again, with same thing, Silverlight, QuickTime, and others, but they didn't get nearly as many vulnerabilities. So the bad guy says, yeah, we're going to go after Flash, right? And at that point, you know, maybe draw another circle around here. After many years of vulnerabilities exposed, Flash seems terribly unsafe and replaced by HTML5, right? Pretty much everywhere. Okay, so again, HTML5 had been around for a little while before this, but Flash was still being used. But, you know, within the last few years, 2016, it started to get phased out, and it got phased out along a lot of sites and applications pretty quick. Yeah, HTML5 is the replacement for that. But the problems were always inherent to Flash. Okay, it wasn't, you know, something new that just happened, but it was something that everybody kind of realized, oh yeah, this is bad and it's not really going away. So basically, this is the long-running thing of replacement of plugins of all kinds by HTML5. Okay. So if we think about this in common sense terms, right, why are the attackers doing what they're doing? Well, number one, if an application is more popular, you're going to get more impact from a particular exploit, right? And that applies to Java applets back in the day when they were popular. Sure, you could get them. Or later on, the very popular Flash games. Again, Angry Birds, Candy Crush, whatever. All those were options too. Number two, open source code. So open source code does tend to be more secure. These things were not open source; they were private. So in theory, you know, the fact that the code is kept hidden from the bad guys makes it harder to find things. And yeah, that does put in a bit of a lag on how long it takes people to find things. But it's also more likely, because there aren't that many eyeballs looking at the code during the development process, it also tends to mean that more vulnerabilities will persist through it. Okay. Last thing, different update cycles. So if different systems are updating their code at different times in an organization, if they're patching it differently, then you might have a vulnerability that exists at one point in an organization but not in another. And all those factors together, you know, tended to help plugins, to help ensure that plugins would always have some vulnerabilities that that the bad guys could attack. Okay, I want to dip back here for a minute, talking about this Apple thing. So about 10 years ago, there was a big conflict between Apple and Adobe Flash. Apple initially said, we aren't going to let our machines run Flash. We know it's buggy, not buggy, it's dangerous, it's vulnerable, it's weak on security. And so they said, yeah, we don't want to do it. Adobe, which owned Flash at the time, said Apple wanted a monopoly on developing apps so it could make all the money from that. And there's probably enough truth to both of those. We can regard those things as not really contradicting each other. They're, you know, largely both true. Interestingly, though, Apple caved in 2010, said, yeah, if you users, if you really want to put Flash on your machines, we'll let you do it, even though we think it's a bad idea. But Adobe stopped developing the Flash plugin for mobile devices in 2011. So just about when Apple opened the gates, then Adobe said, yeah, we're not going to be in that business anymore anyway. So kind of a strange situation. All right. Yeah, and there's a little article here. Apple was among the on the leading edge of blocking Flash. So 2016 it says, yeah, we're just not going to let you use that anymore. It's not safe. Okay. Now the current state, sure, Flash Player still exists, but to the extent that it does exist, it's been replaced. Oh, we got a chat bomb here. How may I help you? Okay, thank you. Thanks to you too. Okay, boom. Okay, what's the difference? We'll, sorry, we got a little back there. So current state, it's been replaced. You can still find it, right? But in terms of development, yeah, they're not really, people aren't really developing stuff in Flash as Flash applications. Instead, they're using something similar, Adobe Air, that basically lets these kind of Flash applications be designed as native ones, not browser ones. The other thing, even though Adobe isn't supporting Flash anymore, that means it's not developing new stuff for it, not trying to fix the problems with it. A lot of designers still like to use it especially because it's good for prototype development. So if a designer wants to come up with an idea for a page or an application, he can very quickly slap it together in these Flash tools and say, this is what it's going to look like, but not actually develop it in Flash in the end. Okay, other things, again, a lot of organizations, individuals have these tools in place, they're familiar with them. So if you wanted to create a video, for example, you could do it in Flash and then use some conversion software to turn a Flash video into some other format. So even though Flash isn't really being used for active web content, it's still being used behind the scenes for development because people are very familiar with it. Okay, last thing. Right, this is going to be the end. Why HTML5? Let me just make sure I have enough battery here. Yeah, I have enough. Okay. Okay, so why HTML5? What's the difference between playing a video in the browser and pulling a video from somewhere else to run as a separate application, right? Well, key thing is, number one, presumably the browser is trustworthy, right? So we're taking that as a dogma. If your browser isn't trustworthy, then boy, you have a lot of problems, right? Because they're lifting all your credit card data, they're lifting everything about you. So we're going to assume going in, all right, the browser's trustworthy, it's not going to do bad stuff. Now, if you're showing a video just in the browser, right, the data gets pulled, it only gets used as an input to the video display. If the browser somehow sees some data that doesn't fit into an image format, it's going to say, hey, something's wrong with this. I'm not going to display it. I'm not going to do anything with it, right? Maybe I'm going to pop up a notification that says, hey, check out, you know, whatever's wrong with this video source. But basically the browser can have control over saying, I am playing a video. If I find some data that doesn't fit in with what a video should do, then I'm just not going to accept that, right? So it's only going to accept standard video frames. And the browser doesn't have to give that application data stream any access to anything else. Okay, but if it's a separate application, again, ideally the application would behave itself and only access the data it needs to. But an application like that, it needs to access portions of the web browser. It needs to be able to figure out where it's going to be shown on the screen. It needs to be able to send data to the web browser. The browser has to send data back, confirming that it's received that data as part of the stream. So there's always going to be a lot of back and forth communication traffic. And sometimes these applications or the data in the applications, they can try to access things that they really shouldn't. And they can try to, once they've grabbed that data, they can try to send it to other places where they really shouldn't. And the browser is generally not going to see that. The reason it's not going to see that is because, again, this outside application, whether it's Java or Flash, is a separate application. Once it gets the data from the browser can't control what that application does with it. Okay, so that's the fundamental concern there. And HTML5 has done a pretty good job of fixing a lot of these problems, which means that a lot of the problems have gone other ways. So things that people used to try to do in terms of hacks through Flash, now they're switching to things like cross-site scripting or phishing attacks, stuff like that. One possibility for attacks goes away, and then something else is going to arise in its place. All right, so Wednesday we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more about these details, but this is it. This is what I got for today. So what did we cover? We covered basically the trace from Applets to Flash, talked a little bit about Ajax, and on Wednesday we'll do some more stuff with Ajax, and then we'll also talk a little bit about some of these kind of security troubles. And that will cover our day. All right, any questions on any of this stuff? Or if not, I suppose you can always defer them to Wednesday. All right, well, that's all I've got then.